welcome to Hampshire Outdoors and Survival. So this video is a couple of stories and a little bit of thoughts about the time of year. It is Halloween, Samhain to some. It is partly Christian, partly pre-Christian. Whichever faith or following you have, this is a time of harvest. This is a time when we've got in all the grains, we've harvested all the fruits, and we're preparing for winter. Our ancestors at this point would be collecting in the last of the mushrooms, they'd be collecting in the last of the nuts, they would be putting their stores aside for winter, building up their firewood supplies. And around this time, as the nights started to draw out, the days became shorter, they would come together and they would celebrate. They would celebrate the fact that they'd survived another year, how the harvests had gone, how the animals were doing, and how they got through it. And they would remember their ancestors, they would remember their fathers, their grandfathers, their heroes and heroines, and they would tell their tales, for the evenings were drawing in, they were becoming longer. Okay? And at this time, our bodies haven't yet adapted to the longer nights, so we're tending to stay awake longer in the evenings. So people would have come together round the fires and they would have told stories. I love the idea of storytelling, although I'm not a particularly good storyteller myself. And over the years, I've had the real pleasure of sitting and listening to some really good bards and listening to them tell tales. I've sat and listened to shaman and people of other nationalities tell their tales, and I've always admired it. So here's my attempt. Tonight I will tell you two tales of my own. Hopefully you'll enjoy them. So this brings me to my first tale. And my first tale is not one of fear. It's one of learning. This happened many, many years ago. And this happened to a young man who lived in a subsistence family. This means a family that live primarily off the land. They gain their resources from what they can grow and what they can harvest naturally. So this young man was about halfway through his teens when his father and his grandfather invited him to join them on his first hunt. And now this hunt meant that they would be travelling into the wilderness for many, many days into areas the young man didn't know. But every year, and every fall, and every autumn, his father and grandfather would go off and they would hunt. And they would take a deer or an elk, and it would be processed and brought back. And this would be their family's main meat supply throughout the entire winter. So this young man goes out, packs his kit, he's excited, he can't wait for this. This is a rite of passage. This is becoming an adult. Okay. And he packs his equipment very, very carefully, checks it with his father and his grandfather. And they both look upon it, smile, encourage, look at one another knowingly, for they've been there themselves. They too followed this path, which meant going on a hunt with the older members of the family and learning the ways. Well, the young man tracked off with his father and his grandfather, and they tracked for many days through the mountains. They followed many paths, some not so well known, some only known to the people of that land, until eventually they came to a valley, and this valley has a river flowing through it. And the father and grandfather looked at the lad and said to him, what we do at this point is we split up. We split up, you remember this point, you mark your path, and if you get lost or there's a problem, you make your way back here. And off they separated. Now the young man had already been taught to use his weapon. He knew and understood it well. He knew he was accurate. He knew how to take the game, and he knew how to process the game because he had done this many times back at the homestead with his grandfather and his father. And he lived in a rural environment. So he had no genuine fear of the woods. He had an understanding of what was around him and what was out there. And with this confidence, he trekked off and he decided he was going to make his way down to the river, follow the river down, and find himself a reasonable clearing down there where he could make his first kill. And he was a little bit excited about this, as he would be as a young man taking that rite of passage. He made his way down the path. He walked all day. And about mid-afternoon, he came to the river. And looking at the clearing that he was on the river, and looking to the other side, he suddenly realised that this clearing on the other side of the river was absolutely perfect. It was absolutely, it had a natural hide, it had everything perfectly set up. The side he was on was scrub, stone and scrub. It's no use for hunting. So he looked at the river and he gauged the river. And he looked and he saw the shallows and he thought, I'll cross the river. It's a risk, but I will cross the river. And then I will get to take something that will make both my father and my grandfather very proud of me. So with all diligence and caution, he found a stick and he started to wade the river. Unfortunately for him, about halfway across, he lost his balance. A stone moved under his foot and down he went. And as we all know, falling into shallow, fast-flowing water, it takes you. But he understood. He got his feet in front of him, did his best to float. He took his pack off, he let his weapon go, and he did everything he could to keep himself floating. And he went with the current. But this current carried him, and it carried him down the river. It carried him away. Well, after about 10 or 15 minutes, he managed to make it to his side, and he was feeling terrible by now. Weak, cold, exhausted, terrified, but he made it to the side of the river. Now, this side of the river he was on now is a very dense forest. It's a pine forest. Very, very dense. Massive boulder fields, lots of moss. Well, he crawled out the river and he looked at this and he thought to himself, I'm in trouble now. I'm lost. I don't know how far down the river I am. I don't know my route back. I'm wet and I'm so on entering the woods. Right, the young man assessed himself and his situation, and he knew that it was fairly dire. He was soaked to the skin. He'd lost his pack. He'd lost his weapon. But he still had with him his knife. And alongside his knife, he had his steel. And knowing with the knife and the steel, he could survive. So the young man set to making a shelter, collecting firewood. And the shelter wasn't the most perfect shelter in the world, but he knew tonight the nights were going to be bitterly cold because it's fall and it's around Samhain, so the skies are clear and temperatures will plummet, and being wet he wouldn't make it through the night. And he built himself a bower type shelter using fir tree branches, bracken, any materials he could find. He created a bed of moss to take him off the floor. And he built a fire. Now, the young man was bright and he was clever and he had his fire steel with him. So alongside his knife, he had the ability to make a spark. Being that it was pine, he looked round and found himself a dead standing pine tree. And he hacked away round the base until he got into some fat wood and managed to get himself out a very small hunk of fat wood, which he then very carefully shaved down. And using his fire and steel, he used this as the basis of his fire. And once he got his fire going, he built it and built it and built it. until it was giving out enough heat to make him feel better, and it was starting to dry him. However, he knew the night was going to be long, for this is the time of fall. The nights are becoming longer, darker, and colder. Now, the young man's not afraid of the dark, has a healthy respect for it. What he is afraid of is falling asleep and freezing to death. For he knows this is pine, it burns quickly. He must keep feeding this fire through the night. He's already exhausted. He hasn't eaten much. He's starting to struggle a little bit. So he builds the fire and he gathers some logs and he stacks the logs next to it. And the night starts to draw in. The wood starts to shrink around him. He can hear animals, he can hear the owls, he can hear the deer calling as the sun sets, and as the sun sets, he can also hear larger animals. He has a fantastic view up a path or up a channel between trees. And about 30 metres up this path steps out the most magnificent stag he has ever seen. This stag has a full crown, massive full crown, a huge deep chest. His coat is magnificent, and it steps out into the path and just looks at him. And anybody that's ever seen the deer and seen one of these majestic stags knows there is a grace and a beauty to these animals. And the boy, not being armed, looks upon this animal and thinks to himself, I knew I'd come to the right place. However, I don't think I'd have taken you because you're too fantastic. You're too amazing. And the boy sits and watches the stag for a while. And eventually the stag, as deer will do, realises there's no threat to this young man and his fire. And it just calmly walks into the undergrowth the other side. Well, the night draws in on him. The forest and the woods starts to shrink. The darkness comes in. The owls start to hoot. Small animals start to scurry around in the undergrowth. The woods becomes a busy place at night, especially for the small things. The boy recognises the sounds of most of these small things. They hold no fear for him. Again, he's just afraid that this fire goes out. He's going to freeze to death. So he feeds the fire, and the hours draw on, and he feeds the fire. And he feeds the fire. But this has a double-sided effect. You see, it's an interesting thing about fire and cold. When you're warm, you start to relax. You start to feel tired. Your body says, it's okay, let's rest. Your eyes start to feel heavy. Your head starts to nod. And eventually you fall asleep. And the fire will burn down ever so slowly, lowering your body temperature. And eventually, you're in a place you won't recover from. And in one of these moments, as the boy's head is nodding up and down, and he's thinking to himself, I must stay awake, he hears a voice in the distance, helloing his camp. Hello? Hello, the camp. Now the boy knows this is an old thing that's been done for centuries. You don't just walk into somebody's camp. That's disrespectful, and it's wrong. You hello a camp, and when the people in the camp hello back to you, you ask to be invited into their camp and to share their camp with them. And the boy thought to himself, this is my chance. This is somebody that can help me. This is somebody that will help me get through the night. And he hellos back, feeling quite keen and relieved. Hello, come into my camp. Please come into my camp. At which point, the biggest man he has ever seen walks into the camp. Now, this guy has a coonskin hat on. He's wearing furs. He has a huge hunting knife strapped to his neck. He's quite an intimidating and scary man. Has a massive bushy beard. But he has the kindest eyes the boy's ever seen. And the guy walks in and smiles and says, "You all right, son?" The boy looks up and says, "Not so good." And the old fella sits down opposite him, draws himself up comfortably in front of the fire and says, "What's happened? Why are you here?" So the boy tells his story and he explains they're a subsistence family. They come into the woods and they take what meat they need for the winter. They forage. And on his first expedition out, he's got separated and fallen into the river and is now terrified that he's not going to make it through the night because he can't keep the fire going. And the old boy sits opposite him, listening to him, and nods sagely and says, "It's all right, son, not a problem. I'm here with you now. I'll help you keep the fire going through the night. You get some sleep. I'll keep the fire going, don't you worry." At which point he takes off one of his skins, lays it over the lad, places a log on the fire, and sits back and just watches through the flames. Well, the night passes, and in the morning the boy wakes up. The old fella's gone. The fire's stoked. Somebody's kept it in. It's still going. It's still keeping him warm. Even though there's a frost everywhere else, for those few metres around that fire where the young man was laying, it's not settled. It's kept the cold off him. He is chilled, but it's kept the cold off of him. So he crunches up over the fire. "Hello? Hello, where have you gone? Where have you gone?" There's no answer. So the boy starts to look around and he sees on one of the trees, about eyeball height, there's been a notch marked. And he looks at it and he says, "Ah, the chap must have gone back to his camp this morning. But what he's done is marked a route for me out of the woods, because this is the sort of thing that good woodsmen do. They create trails, they mark trails, and they lead people to safety." So the boy's feeling confident now. Perhaps he knows where my dad is. Perhaps he knows where my grandfather is. He's left me a mark. He's left me a trail to follow. "Ah, thank you so much." And the boy, being a good woodsman, lets the fire burn down as much as possible. And then, using his shirt, he gathers water and he douses it completely, and he makes sure it's doused. He feels into the ashes and he makes sure the fire's out. He then sorts himself out, has a drink from the river, and thinks to himself, "It's going to be a long walk today, but I have a route. The man's marked me a route. I'll follow it." And he goes up and he stands at the first mark and has a look around. And as he looks around, he sees another mark 10 metres away on another tree. "Yeah, that's definitely what he's done. He's marked me a route to safety. Oh, thank you. I must remember to thank him when I meet him again." And he walks on. And again, this is repeated. He comes to this tree, there's a mark on it. There's another mark 10 metres ahead on another tree. So the boy starts following these marks and he walks. And he walks for about 5 hours until eventually he comes to a clearing and he recognises this clearing. This is the clearing that he was trying to get to when he got lost. It's fantastic, fantastic. And he stops on the clearing and he sits down for a minute in the sun thinking, "Oh, dude, yeah, I'm safe now. I know my way back from here. I've just got to get across the river a bit more carefully this time, but get back across the river and I will be fine." So he finds himself a stick, and this time very carefully he makes his way across the river, also keeping an eye open for his pack and his weapon, which unfortunately are long gone. And he makes his way out of the other side of the river, and he starts to go back to the RV point, the point that him and his father and his grandfather had set at the beginning of the journey. And as he's walking back, he's thinking to himself, "I'm going to be in trouble now. I've lost a pack, I've lost the weapon. I nearly lost myself. I won't be in trouble now. I'm just going to have to explain it as it happened and apologise. That's all I can do. And he walks on through the day. And again, just as the evening is starting to come in and he's starting to think, I'm going to have to make another fire, he comes to the RV. But when he comes to the RV, he finds his grandfather and his father sitting there around a fire that is going. And it's a large, well-stoked, well-maintained fire. And he looks at them and he says, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I got lost. I had a fall in the river. I got lost and washed down the river. I nearly died. I managed to get out. And his grandfather and his father are listening. And they said to him, what happened? How did you survive? So he explained to him he'd made the shelter and he started the fire. But the difficulty he had was staying awake and maintaining that fire, knowing that he had to keep it going all night or he would die from hypothermia. And then he explained that a hunter appeared, a man of the woods, a mountain man, a trapper, helloed him, came into his camp, and spent the night with him. And his grandfather smiled and said, my son, you have met Hearn. Hearn is an old man who lives in these mountains. He's been here for a very long time. He will always help those that are in need of help. Those that are honest, only take what they need, and aren't greedy, will always gain his help. However, son, remember this. If you're greedy, if you don't respect the nature, and you don't care, he can also lead you astray. That's the end of my story. I hope you enjoyed that. That was just thrown together this afternoon while sitting having a cup of tea. Based on a legend I heard a long time ago, very, very similar. I've just modernised it a little bit and changed the language. The second tale I'd like to tell you, you can judge for yourself. Did it happen? Did it not happen? So as many of you know, I've worked in and around the military most of my life, and this was a story that was passed on to me many years ago. And I've taken notes, so you will have to excuse me looking down, because I want to tell this tale as it was told to me. This takes part a long time ago. Okay. Two young soldiers on a pre-selection training course on their own time have been training over several months. The course they're intending to do is an intense and difficult course. So to build up to this, these guys are going out and they're training on the hills. They're meeting up at weekends and they're getting into the hills and they're getting the mileage behind them. They're building up that stamina. They're building up that strength. So they head out. They meet up on this particular weekend. They meet up on a Friday night just outside a little village. They got their basic packs with them because the weather's not looking too bad. The weather reports for this weekend are fairly mild, so they're running with basic kit. Okay, and off they go. And their plan is to walk a route of about 30 miles in the mountains over the weekend, practicing being off the main tracks. They're not interested in following the easy routes. They're actually pushing themselves through the tougher stuff. Anyhow, they start off up the mountain. And about 4 hours into their walk, they realise that the wind is changing direction. And it's starting to get dark. But it's getting dark a little bit early. Now, for any of you that have ever been in the mountains, you'll know that the weather up there can change much quicker sometimes than it does on the ground. because there's nothing to obscure it. There's nothing to slow it down. The wind can just come through and change the conditions very, very quickly. And as you gain altitude, temperatures start to vary very fast. Okay, so as they walk up, as they get into this situation, they start to think to themselves, this isn't so good. Do we push on? Or do we stop? Do we head back? What do we do? So they consult the time, they look at the time, they realise that the climb that they've had up is quite steep and difficult. If they head back, it's going to be dark. It's not worth the risk. A broken leg, a damaged knee will put them back months on their training, and that will put them out of their selection course. So they push on, and they're looking for somewhere sheltered. And as they move on, the conditions change. They get worse and worse and worse, and it develops into one of those or one of those autumn storms that you sometimes get on the mountains, where the temperature becomes cold enough for what would have normally been rain to turn to sleet. But again, there's nowhere to shelter. They're looking, can't find any shelter. So they keep pushing, they keep pushing, they keep pushing, and eventually they find a dry stone wall. And as they're approaching this dry stone wall, the sleet has turned to snow, and it's settling fast. Now they know this condition is severe because this is hiding the path. This is also hiding the terrain that they're on, broken legs, injuries and that, and they need to get out of the wind. So they find the wall, and this wall, dry stone wall, the wind's hitting it one side and building the snow up on that side. So they drop to the leeward side and they huddle in together as close to the wall as they can. They pull out a poncho, they place the poncho over themselves, and they are soaking. It's freezing, they are soaking, and they huddle up under this together. Well, they're sharing their body heat. They're trying to keep themselves going, and it is bitter. And after several hours, they realise that the snow is starting to settle on this side as well. The wind has stopped it. It's just coming down vertically, and it's heavy. Oh, it was heavy. And it's building up. They can feel the weight of the snow building on the poncho, and they're having to tap it to keep it off, and they're getting colder and colder and colder. And hypothermia is just starting to set in when they hear a voice. And they're thinking to themselves, somebody up here? Is there somebody up here? Who will be up here in this? Right? And at which point they hear a snuffling, and the poncho moves, and one of the guys lifts up the corner of the poncho, and a collie pokes its head in. A sheepdog pokes its head in, and it pushes in amongst them. And this collie's warm, and they're both holding the dog. And the dog's licking their faces, wagging its tail, and all the rest of it. And they're carrying the dog. And they realise there must be somebody out there with the dog. So they start calling out to them, hello, are you okay? Are you okay? Because they know the conditions are bad. And if they're in a bad way, hopefully this person's okay. If the worst comes to worst, they can get this person into a shelter with them, and the three of them with the dog will make it through the night. Well, eventually, the shelter moves, and a guy lifts up the end of it, and there is a shepherd, an old boy, and he stood there and he looks down at him and goes, you lads all right? And they're like, no. He said, well, look, come on. He said, I'll take you to shelter, I'll take you to my bothy, and we'll spend the night in my bothy. He said, it's only up the way a little bit, it's warm, it's sheltered, you'll be safe, boys. You come with me and I'll make sure you're okay. So they go with him and the dog, and they follow him up a path, and this path climbs further up the mountains. Now, for anybody that's not in the UK, bothies are normally built way up in the tops of the mountains where the shepherds would tend or spend time with their sheep, and sometimes the shepherds would stay up here for months on end. And these little tiny stone huts, simple fireplace, they would maintain what they needed to look after their flocks. And the shepherd leads them to this bothy, and they come into the bothy, and it's just a small bothy, just a tiny little place, but it's warm. The fire's going in there, and the two guys get in, warm themselves by the fire, hunker themselves down, and start chatting. And they're like, oh, thank you for finding us. And the old boy says, well, I'd seen you on the hills. I'd seen you earlier on. And I'd looked at the weather and knew it was bad. I knew it was going to get worse. So I just kept an eye out for you, see if you were okay. And as it got to that point where I knew you'd be in trouble, he said, I thought I'd best come and get you. And you're more than welcome to spend the night in my bothy. More than welcome. But unfortunately, I don't have much left in the way of supplies, for I'm hoping to come down in the next few days. He said, normally I'd have a couple of cans of beer, there'd be tea, coffee, and I'd be able to offer you smokes. He said, but unfortunately, yeah, things are a bit tight and a bit short. The boys didn't mind this. They didn't mind at all. They were like, doesn't matter. And the old boy explains, his name's Bill. He's been a shepherd for many years. He's lived up there and he's seen lots of winters. And they spend the best part of the night chatting away to this lovely chap. He explains to them, about the hills, the sheep and the dogs and that. And every now and again he sort of looks over and goes, I'd love a smoke. And unfortunately, these are modern soldiers. They don't smoke. And I'm sorry, Bill, we don't smoke, mate. And he's like, that's all right, lads. That's all right, lads. We'll get through the night. I'll be down in a day or two. I'll be able to get down to the pub, get some cigarettes, and I'll be sorted. Anyhow, they spent the night with Bill up there. And they had a pretty good time by all accounts. However, come the morning, they look out and the snow is still settled on everything. It's looking very, very dodgy. But Bill says to them, he says, it's all right, boys. What I'll do, I'll guide you back to the main path. I'll take you to the main route down. There's a track about 2 miles over there. Follow me down. I'll take you to the track. You can make your way back down to the village. It'll get you down safely. And both guys by now, they've been through enough tonight. They're like, yeah, end X. We're going home. Let's get back to camp, have a shower, get ourselves sorted out. That was a close call thing. So they thank Bill profusely. And him and his dog guide them through these little tiny paths until they come to the track. He gets them onto the track and they make their way down the mountain. Okay. They come back down into the village, and by the time they get down into the village is just waking up. But they think to themselves, right, do you know what? That's enough. End X. And we've all been there, cold and exhausted. And they get into their vehicle and they go back to camp. And obviously, when they get back to camp, it's get off, shower. Well, they spend the rest of the weekend on camp, talking amongst themselves about what happened and how fantastic and lucky they were that this old shepherd up on the hills saved their life and how they appreciated it. And they were chatting about it, and they said, well, let's go back up next weekend. Let's go back up next weekend and find him. Let's go back to the village. We'll find him, and what we'll do, we'll take him a slab of beers and some smokes, because he really wanted his smokes. So they get together, they get down to Naff, and they buy a slab of beers, buy 200 fags, and come the next Friday, they have these packed in their kit. So there's a Bergen on, 24 cans in a Bergen, 200 smokes, a box of swab vestas just in case. And they head back to the village. And they get back to the village and decide, right, up we go. And off they go. They walk up. They walk into the hills. They follow the same track up that they came down. It's identical. They follow it all the way up. And these are clever switched on guys. They're like, right, okie doke. Is this the little path we came into the track on? And they take the path and they walk into the hills. And they walk and they walk and they walk. And they're following these tracks back. And eventually they come round a corner to where they're expecting to find the bothy. And it's not there. All that's there is a broken down bothy. Just a few boulders, bricks, the remains of a roof, and an old iron stove sat in one corner. It's got to be the place, but it's obviously not. Okay, let's rethink this. We've taken a wrong turning. I'll tell you what we'll do. He said he was coming off the mountain. Let's go back down to the village and find him. He must live in the village. Let's go back and find him. So So they brace themselves up, they turn round, they walk back down to the village. It takes them a couple of hours. They get down to the village, but these two guys aren't too bothered. They're fit lads, and again, they're training. So they're not too worried. They walk all the way back down to the village, and they get to the village, and it is one of those tiny little villages. And they stroll around, and they're saying to people, "Excuse me, do you know where Bill the Shepherd lives?" "No, don't know Bill the Shepherd." "Oh, right. Do you know Bill the Shepherd?" "No, don't know Bill the Shepherd." So eventually, one of them says, "Well, I know who will know him. There's a little post office down there, and the post office knows everybody that lives in the village. Let's go down there." So they go to the post office, go into the post office, and as you find in a lot of these quaint old village post offices, there's a fairly older lady postmistress. Okay? And as we all know, a postmistress is a person of wisdom. She knows everything that goes on in the village. So I said to her, "Excuse me, my love, we had a very bad situation last week in the storm. We got trapped up on the hills, and we were rescued and saved by a shepherd called Bill. And we're trying to find where he lives because we owe him some beers and smokes, and we wonder if you could tell us whereabouts he lives." And she looks at him and says, "Tell me his name." I said, "Bill, shepherd, got a collie." And they described him. She said, "Oh, I suggest you come into the back room and have a cup of tea." Well, they both look at one another. "Well, you don't have to." "No, no, I suggest you do." So she takes them into the back room. She makes them a cup of tea, sits them both down. She sits down opposite them and says this: "About 30 years ago, a group of young soldiers, recruits I think they were taken up onto the hills to train in winter. And we had one of the worst storms we'd had in a century. It snowed like hell. And the men of the village got together along with the military guys, and they went up to bring these recruits off. And over the best part of an evening, they managed to find most of them and get them down. However, there was two still lost up there, and the storm got worse and worse and worse, to the point where the men of the village, until the point and the officers, where the MOD, the officers, and the men of the village decided it were too dangerous, and no one were going back up on the hills to look for these two poor lost lads, except for Bill and his dog, for they lived amongst them hills for the best part of the year, living out of his bothy. And Bill said, I'd be damned if some bugger's going to die up there on my hill. And off he went into the night, into the storm. Last anybody see of him was Bill, lamp in hand, with his crook and his dog, going up that track into them hills. 2 days later, they found the bodies. They found Bill, his dog, and the two young soldiers huddled up together behind one of the walls up on the meadows. They brought him down. He's buried in the graveyard. Well, as you can imagine, the two young men were quite surprised, shocked to hear this story. And they sat with the old girl, had tea, and she told them of Bill. She knew him, she'd grown up with him, and she was a young girl as he was an older man, and she knew the stories of him and how he'd spend his time up in the hills caring for his sheep. Had a love of those hills. So the two guys decided on leaving that they would walk back up to the bothy couple of hours still training, just to try and get their heads around it, really. Try and deal with it. What the hell had happened? I mean, none of these guys were, or neither of these guys were the sort to have wild dreams of ghosts or spirits and things like that, but they knew what they'd experienced. The description of Bill and his dog matched 100%. So they walked back up to that old, broken down bothy, and they spent a few hours just talking and looking and thinking. And then, before it started getting dark, they walked back down to the village. They never went back there again. So I'll tell you this. If you're ever up on them hills, you find an old broken down bothy, and inside that broken down bothy, you find a slab of beers and 200 cigarettes. You leave them alone. We left them there for Bill. Mickey out.